distinguished participants and speakers, welcome back to the fourth Greenhouse Gas Inventory System Training Workshop. I am Yoo-jung Kim, Senior Development Management Expert from the United Nations Office for Sustainable Development, based in Incheon, Korea. This event is co-organized by United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, UNESCOP, and Institute for Global Climate and Ecology, IGCE, Thailand Greenhouse Gas Management Organization, TGO, and the UNOSD. The main objective of this workshop is to provide capacity building for developing countries with a focus on Asia-Pacific region, on utilizing national greenhouse gas inventories for the implementation of SDG 13 and the Paris Agreement. Yesterday, we had wonderful presentations from IPCC and WMO that set the scene with the climate science. And then we heard from UNESCOP on whether the Asia-Pacific region can meet the 1.5 degrees target. And we also heard from the Republic of Korea on their experience with the NDC. And today we prepared topics that are more directly related to the greenhouse gas inventories. We'll start with the outcomes of the UNFCCC COP26, including the transparency framework. And then we'll dive into the methodologies for inventories and the Paris Agreement reporting. Please note that the presentation material and the recordings will be available at the UNOSD website and UNOSD YouTube channel. I'm afraid our website is still unavailable and we are sorry for the inconvenience. We expect it'll be open soon. Now, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them in the chat. Like yesterday, this event is being live streamed on TGO's Facebook page as well. Now, I would like to open today's session with the presentation by Mr. Sergei Kononov and Mr. Vitor Gois Ferreira. Mr. Kononov is a manager of Transparency Division in UNFCCC Secretariat, and he will speak about the key outcomes of COP26. Mr. Kononov, thanks for coming back for this year's workshop. And if you're ready, now the floor is yours.
Sure. Thank you very much. May I share the screen? Because it may not allow me.
Yes, you can share your screen.
Can you see it now?
Yes, we can see your screen. Okay. Can you make it a full screen?
Yeah, sure. Okay, thank you. And we are pleased to have this opportunity to share our assessment of the key topics and outcomes of COP26 with you at this important workshop. As you already heard, there will be two presenters, myself and my colleague Vitor Gois Ferreira. I will be talking about more general things, and Vitor will dive deeper into the outcomes which directly relate to the topic of this workshop. Before talking about the outcomes, let's take a look at what we actually had before the Glasgow conference. If you look at the major objectives of the Paris Agreement in its Article 2, there we find temperature-related objectives like holding the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius and pursuing efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees, increasing the ability to adapt and making financial flows consistent with the pathways towards low greenhouse gas emissions development. For all of these objectives and for quite a few other provisions of the Paris Agreement, there was a sense of urgency in upscaling the action on climate because such action was considered really insufficient This was confirmed by various reports published before Glasgow, the IPCC report, the WMO documentation, including the climate, the bulletin on the state of global climate, our NDC synthesis report, the UNEP gap report, and all this was indicating that there is indeed urgency to upscale climate action. This feeling of urgency was exacerbated by the well-known delay in the UNFCCC process when, for well-known reasons, we did not have real conferences, real meetings for almost 2 years. So against this background, parties came ready to work hard to Glasgow, and the motto, keep 1.5 degrees alive, was well placed. So the parties acted to keep indeed 1.5 degrees Celsius alive. This was underpinned by the hard work of the commitment and engaged presidency of the COP, the United Kingdom. And as a result, we saw major advances in all key negotiation areas, which include finance, adaptations, loss and damage, mitigation, transparency, Article 6, and we also saw quite important progress regarding action by non-party stakeholders. So with this introductory word, let's take a look at the outcomes of the conference. And I'm talking here about only key outcomes, not about everything. But even talking about key outcomes, you already see a slide which is full of content. So I will try to refrain from reading everything. You can see it, and reading every word will not really make it stronger. What we can see here is indeed the outcomes were achieved in finance, in action regarding mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, in Article 6 and transition to the Paris Agreement instruments from the Kyoto Protocol's mechanisms, and in transparency, which is particularly relevant to your meeting here. One could also put these outcomes into two broad categories, which are of course overlapping. One would be ramping ambition and action, and another one would be closing the so-called Paris rulebook. And both are really of major importance for action against climate change. For finance, parties addressed the gap to the 100 billion goal, the goal of mobilizing finance to the level of 100 billion annually. The goal was not reached, and it is not yet reached, but the gap was discussed, assessed, and a delivery plan to catch up was considered, which was probably maximum possible at that time for this goal. Simultaneously, parties decided on a process to define a new post-2025 goal on finance, which will start this year. For mitigation, importantly, parties were called to revisit their 2030 targets, and those parties which have not yet submitted revised, updated on new NDCs were invited to or called upon to do so as soon as possible. The conference decided to set up a mitigation work program. Its details were not decided at all, and they will be developed during this year, and we hope for a decision on the scope, milestones, and the whole content of the mitigation work program to be taken at the end of this year at COP27. We have a number of other outcomes mitigation related, which are mitigation related, like parties decided to make the NDC synthesis report, which was published in that format for the first time in Glasgow, an annual report, and it will help parties monitoring parties' progress in implementing the Paris Agreement. And a few other outcomes also include such innovative or quite new things as a reference to the phase down of unabated coal power, or a call to phase out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies, which happened, if I'm not mistaken, for the very first time in the UNFCCC process overall. For adaptation, it was emphasized the need to put adaptation in parity with mitigation, in particular regarding support. And we already saw in Glasgow some encouraging signs like record pledges of support to the adaptation fund and call to parties to double adaptation finance by 2025 compared to 2019. The COP in Glasgow decided on a 2-year work program to work on the global goal on adaptation to make it better quantifiable and better suitable for a follow-up as we implement the Paris Agreement. Similarly to loss and damage, we see a recognition of its importance, of the importance of action to address loss and damage relating to climate change. And there were advances on the functions of the Santiago network on loss and damage and the launch of a 3-year Glasgow dialogue on how to address the funding arrangements on loss and damage. Then on Article 6 and transition from the CDM to Article 6 instruments, this was indeed a breakthrough. I don't know whether you had experience with those negotiations, but the negotiations on Article 6 instruments continued for 6 years. So they started immediately after the Paris conference in 2016, and until Glasgow, it was very challenging to find consensus on this very complex and very delicate set of rules. And this happened in Glasgow, and this was indeed considered as one of the major outcomes of the conference. And now we come to transparency, which is quite close to the topic of your meeting. We had actually a political set of decisions on transparency adopted already in Katowice, but operational guidance was missing. What would be the format of the reporting tables, what tools should be used, and what training would be needed. And this operational guidance was provided by the Glasgow conference. In particular, decisions were taken on the formats of reporting, on the tools to be used, and on the training needed. We will also have, importantly, an annual agenda item under the CMA, the Conference on the Paris Agreement, to follow up on support arrangements transparency framework, because as all parties recognized, the availability of support in its various forms is key to make developing countries capable of implementing those transparency provisions. So it's again, I try not to list each and every item, but I hope I have managed to communicate to you a sense that a lot was achieved in Glasgow. And now I would like to ask Vito to take over and to talk with a couple of slides in more detail on what was achieved in transparency at COP27 in Glasgow. Vito, please go ahead.
Thank you, Sergey. I hope you can hear me. Good evening, good morning to all. So I'll focus now on the part on the transparency that was in the slide by Sergey, and it's important to mention first Decision 1 CMA3, the Glasgow Climate Pact, addressing ETF in enhanced transparency format, and urging parties to swiftly make the necessary presentations for ensuring the timely reporting under the ETF and the Paris Agreement. So then there is a particular specific decision, Decision 5 CMA3, so-called methodological issues relating to the ETF for action and support, so the under Paris Agreement Article 13. And this decision ensures the operationalizations of the Paris Agreement, as Sergey mentioned, what was missing, the Paris rulebook, and also the Katowice decisions. And in particular, it's also relevant to mention the modalities, procedures, and guidelines, MPTs, that coming from Katowice. So it was operationalization of all of this. The first 3 bullets This is the parties adopt this free set of reporting tables that following the mandate in Katowice. And first place, the tables for reporting on GHG inventories, which I think is a particular interest for you, and they called CRT. And these news tables allow parties, all parties, to report the necessary information on emissions and removals and associated information such as activity data, implied emission factors, parameters, indirect emissions, and some essential parameters for transparency reporting, and also are important to facilitate the review of data information. So they are closely linked to section 2 in the MPGs. And we also have the common reporting tables for reporting information necessary to track progress made in implementing and achieving the NDCs, the National Determined Contributions, under Article 4 of the Paris. This is another section of the MPGs, section 3. And then finally, we have the common reporting tables. And for information on financial technology development, transfer, and capacity building. And this is also related to two sections of the Paris agreements on the support provided and mobilized, section 5, and then section 6 on the information on finance, technology and capacity building needed and received, basically from developing countries. So the agreed formats, you can see them if you go to this decision, and they have links, or they have annexed those tables that are agreed. And the fourth bullet, which is also relevant, they were adopted the outlines, the table of contents for the biannual transparent reports, BTRs, and the national inventory document, which two important components also on the reporting by parties. And actually those are encouraged, and also adopted the outlines for the reports by technical expert reviews, that they will conduct reviews and publish these reports. On the side, there's also a request by the Secretary, by UNFCCC Secretariat, to establish a web portal to facilitate the availability of the informations. And then now we move to the important point, is the training program for technical experts participating in technical review of the BTRs under the MPGs and the Paris agreements. And so the transparency divisions includes detailed provisions for the development of this training program, including the incorporations of advice that by consultation group of experts, lead reviewers, and the steps and dates. So basically, the training materials should be available in 2023. March for the overview part, and for the whole part of the training, September. Also contains specific guidance on flexibility. Flexibility is a concept that was established on the MPGs, and where developing parties, those developing country parties that need it in the light of their capacities, so they can use some provisions in MPGs in flexibility in reporting. So these options are detailed in MPGs, and this is a decision that is self-determined by the parties. And also there's some information, we can go into more details if necessary, but there's also information on reporting confidential information when a minimum level of aggregation is needed to protect the confidential business and military information. So this is something new in comparison what, for instance, Annex 1 parties or developed country parties have been reporting before. Also very important, the next part is the development of reporting tools for the reporting of the tables, and the provisions set the steps and deadlines for development of these tools, and briefly, I can tell you that also these materials should be available in 2023. First a test version, and then finalized in June 2024. So it also includes, in that regard, training for parties on the use of tools, manuals, and also related to this is the joint action by the UNFCCC Secretariat and the IPCC to develop tools to facilitate the interoperability between the reporting tools, UNFCCC reporting tools, and the IPCC inventory software. Finally, a few other aspects related to transparency regarding information related to adaptation and the impacts and adaptations that is assured in the MPGs, which is not mandatory, and the review was also not covered. And then voluntary review of such information may take place on a voluntary basis. And there will be further guidance developed by SABSTA and CMA4. And then also a provision related to the committee to facilitate implementation and promote compliance. And then also other information about what global warming potential values will be used, and also the use of 2019 refinements can be used on a voluntary basis. So Sergey, if you're in control, if you could move to the next slide, please. All right, thank you. Yes, thank you. And this slide, the second slide, focus on support to developing country parties for transition to the ETF. So Sergey also mentioned it in the previous slide, and again mentioning that parties in Glasgow also addressed the need to ensure the provisions of financial and technical support to developing parties as a condition so that they could enhance the reporting, contribute to their capacity building. This again is framed more generally on Decision 1 CMA3, the Glasgow Climate Pact, and acknowledging the call from developing countries for increased support. In that regard, the transparency divisions covers three important areas. It invites developing country parties and other parties on a voluntary basis to provide financial reports, to enable the Secretariat to provide training to all parties on using the reporting tables and tools, and to include at each CMA session an agenda which will consider the support provided. This was also described by Sergey, and recognize the need for enhanced support from various sources and channels, in particular the GEF, the Global Environmental Facility to implement ETF, and including support for developing countries to develop their BTRs. And also in that regard, encourage developing countries to submit proposals to GEF. Other decisions complemented not in Decision 5 CMA3 were agreed was the Capacity Building Initiative for Transparency, so-called CBIT, that was established in Decision 1 CP21, will continue to support developing country parties upon their requests for support. And then there's also specifies the role of the consultative group of experts, CGE again, and they set the new terms of reference, and then it clarifies their technical advice to developing countries, and also on the training and compositions of teams of review experts, but that's something already existing. I think try to be brief, but it was much information. So over to you, Sergey. Thank you.
Yeah, well, it's difficult to be really brief because you work on greenhouse gas inventories, and I'm sure you all know how important these details are, and exactly seeing how much detail was actually agreed in Glasgow, you can understand why it was so important to have this work completed, because without those details, the enhanced transparency framework could not function. Okay, well, thank you, Vitor, again. And I move now to the more general part of the presentation, which will be quick. Just one slide, again, not for reading, but for an overview. When assessing the outcomes of the Glasgow conference, we need to remember that not only the so-called negotiated outcomes matter, but there also matters what action was agreed or pledged beyond the formal negotiations. And here we saw important advancements and an important momentum being strengthened by the Glasgow conference, like the two campaigns managed by the climate champions in the UNFCCC process, Race to Zero and Race to Resilience, received additional push in their work. Under the lead of the UK presidency, the so-called Glasgow Breakthrough Agenda was adopted. And this agenda allows parties to work on clean technologies and sustainable solutions across all key areas of the economy. On forests, we saw the adoption of Glasgow Leaders Declarations on forests and land use, and this is to help in that very important effort to halt and reverse forest loss and land degradation. More than 140 countries joined that initiative, and maybe it's even more by now. Regarding methane, we saw the Global Methane Pledge, which is a US and the EU-led initiative. Again, more than 100 countries joined in an effort to reducing methane emissions significantly within this decade. And on finance, we saw important advances also beyond the negotiation framework, like significant pledges to the of support to the adaptation fund. It was actually the year of record pledges, and the Global Forest Finance Pledge, where a dozen countries committed to provide support to aiming to halt and reverse forest loss and land degradation. With this, I would like to conclude indicating that Glasgow was a significant positive milestone in the international climate change process. And I hope you saw this with this brief overview of the outcomes. And remember, I showed only part of those outcomes, those which are mostly visible, but there have been more. And you can find it in Glasgow decisions. So it was, I believe, a truly successful UN conference, and it acted on climate change based on scientific findings and advice from science. Of course, obviously, limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees was not achieved in Glasgow, and I don't think it was realistic for this to expect, although you may have seen some expectation of that level. But this goal cannot be delivered by Glasgow, could not be delivered by Glasgow, and I don't think it can be delivered by any individual conference. What will deliver is action in the countries and by governments, but non-state actors. This action is needed and it has to be strengthened. So what the work you are doing at this seminar and at your home offices is much relevant to that action. Of course, well, as even if the 1.5 objective was not achieved, this objective was kept alive, and COP26 made its contribution to accelerating climate action and to make it more ambitious. And I would also like to finish by indicating that once again, multilateralism within the UN context has delivered, and it's indeed the right approach to global issues. And this finishes our presentation. I'm afraid we may have taken a bit more time than we were allocated, but we have 3 more detailed slides on what flexibility for developing countries means on the approach to aggregation, as Victor mentioned, and on a few other relevant provisions. So you can find these in the presentation, which will, of course, be available to you. But I don't want to go through them because you have also other things which are not less important than our presentation. Thank you. And of course, Vita and I would be happy to answer any questions should you have some. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sergey and Vitor, for your informative presentation. We have a couple of questions in the chat, but we'll have this Q&A session after all the presentations are delivered. So I kindly ask you to please stay with us. And now we will move on to the next topic, which is Introduction to Methodologies for GHG Inventories and Paris Agreement Reporting. We have allocated 70 minutes for this topic, and the presentation will be led by 3 speakers from IGCE. Dr. Oksana Lipka, Deputy Head of Department, Dr. Alexander Nakutin, Head of Department and UNFCCC GHG Inventory Focal Point in the Russian Federation, and Dr. Veronika Ginsberg, Deputy Director and Head of Department. Now, Oksana, if you're ready, the mic is yours.
Thank you, colleagues. Can you see my presentation?
Yes, we can see your presentation. Can you make it full screen?
I'm trying. Yes. Thank you very much for this great opportunity to take part in so important and valuable seminar and present results of our work and our perhaps ways how to go future and how to help other countries in this quite a
I'm sorry to interrupt, but the slide is still small size. Can you put the
it is full size in at my computer. So can you start my presentation by your team?
Absolutely.
Okay, I've stopped my presentation.
There you go.
Next slide, please. This activity has been started under the project of UNSCAP, supporting countries in Asia Pacific to meet commitments to the Paris Agreement. And the idea was to produce an online tool to help, first of all, Central Asian countries. When we started to work, we understood that this tool will be valuable for all developing countries who have now to improve their greenhouse gas emission reporting. So we followed IPCC procedures, rules, instructions, etc. And our online tool contains main reporting rules, main inventory and calculation principles, which are also very important, and guidance per sectors, which contains not only explanation of sectors, but also methodologies how to calculate and perhaps description of some difficulties in each section and recommendations from our side, because our staff has a good experience not only in preparation of Russian national inventory, but also in working jointly with other countries, sometimes correction of the results and the work like and auditors of such inventories. Next, please. So, of course, when we are talking about reporting of GHG emissions, the main background information is guidelines, IPCC guidelines for national greenhouse gas inventories and the refinements to them. Also, we provide here our expertise as agency which is responsible for national reporting, and so we think that our experience in improvement of our reporting will be valuable for non-Annex 1 countries. And the post-Paris Agreement decisions about how have we to change our reporting, how have we to improve it, especially for developing countries to be in compliance with the Paris Agreements. We gathered a quite strong team from the lead authors of IPCC 26 guidelines for national inventories, of authors of refinements, members of the editorial board of the IPCC emission factor database, lead author of IPCC 6 assessment report working group 3, and including from our side UNFCCC greenhouse gas inventory focal point in the Russian Federation, who will present the next part of the presentation. Next slide, please. So as target group, we were oriented on employees of relevant organizations responsible for greenhouse gas reporting preparation in non-Annex 1 countries. So when we are talking the online tool, you can find there not only user guides, but also presentations from our seminars. About sectors, each sector contains description of categories, links, online links with IPCC guidance and other relevant tools, recommendations, and of course, presentations. Next slide, please. We trained this system twice for today in Kazakhstan as a pilot country, and for 5 Central Asia countries last year with support of Regional Environment Center for Central Asia. And now we are going to conduct one new seminar for 8 countries in Kazakhstan in April, and one specific seminar for Kyrgyzstan to go with this country deeper into details concerning their greenhouse gas emission inventory and difficulties which they see there. Next slide, please. Online tool is completely bilingual. You can find it by this link, and it's available in English and in Russian languages. This was done because for Central Asia and some other post-Soviet countries, Russian is still more familiar than English. Next slide, please. Now you can see how the main tool look like with interactive links. Next slide, please. And also it is possible to download this tool as a book with the description of the whole methodologies also into language. You can select which is more comfortable for you. Next, please. Thank you very much, colleagues. This is the website where you can reach the online tool and download the methodologies. Now I'm giving the floor to my colleagues.
Good morning and good afternoon, dear colleagues. My name is Alexander Nakhutin, not Oksana Lipka, as you can see it on your screens. It is because of some problems with connection, and my apologies for this, and my special apologies to Oksana. Could you show my slides on the screen? Okay, thank you. I will speak about key decisions and methodological guidelines guiding the Paris Agreement reporting on the national greenhouse gas inventories of emissions and removals, and about methodologies for estimating and reporting GHG emissions and removals. Next slide, please. Here we can see the hierarchy of key decisions on the inventory reporting. Of course, in the center is Article 15 of the Paris Agreement, which establishes an enhanced transparency framework for action and support. It should be mentioned that this enhanced transparency framework is not only for greenhouse gas inventories, it has a wide scope, all reporting is covered, but today I will speak only the national inventory reporting. The next is the decision 18/CMA.1, which was approved in Katowice. It is about modalities, procedures, and guidelines for the transparency framework. And the last decision is decision 5/CMA.3, which was approved in Glasgow last year. It is a mistake in the number of decision, .3, not .1, as it is here written. I'm sorry for this. The decision is on guidance for operationalizing the modalities, procedures, and guidelines for the enhanced transparency framework. Next slide, please. So, about the Article 13 of the Paris Agreement. It's just a quotation. In order to build mutual trust and confidence and to promote effective implementation and enhance transparency framework for action and support, we've built in flexibility which takes into account parties' different capacities and builds upon collective experience is hereby established. The transparency framework shall build on and enhance the transparency arrangements under the convention, recognizing the special circumstances of the least developed countries and small island developing states, and be implemented in a facilitative, non-intrusive, non-punitive manner, respectful of national sovereignty, and avoid placing an undue burden on parties. The purpose of the framework for transparency of action is to provide a clear understanding of climate change action in the light of the objective of the convention as set out in its Article 2, including clarity and tracking of progress towards achieving parties' individual nationally determined contributions under Article 4, including good practices, priorities, needs, and gaps to inform the global stocktake under Article 13. Next slide, please. This picture shows the role of the enhanced transparency framework in the general implementation of the Paris Agreement. In the center of this process is rising the ambition of the countries on struggling with climate change. And as it can be seen, the enhanced transparency framework is a part of implementation and compliance of the Paris Agreement. It informs the global stocktake and science, and it informs means of implementation and actions on mitigation and adaptation. And it is a never-ending repeating process. Next slide, please. Let's speak about modalities, procedures, and guiding principles for the enhanced transparency framework. It is also shortly called MPGs. MPGs were adopted by the decision 18/CMA.1 in Katowice, and their guiding principles are the following. The importance of facilitating improved reporting and transparency over time, providing flexibility to those developing country parties that need it in the light of their capacities, promoting transparency, accuracy, completeness, consistency, and comparability, avoiding duplication of work and undue burden on parties and the UNFCCC Secretariat, ensuring that parties maintain at least the frequency and quality of reporting in accordance with their respective obligations under the Convention, ensuring that double counting is avoided, ensuring environmental integrity. Next slide, please. The guidance operationalizing the modalities, procedures, and guidelines for enhanced transparency framework was adopted at the Glasgow conference in 2021. In particular, the Glasgow conference adopted the common reporting tables for electronic reporting of the information in the national inventory reports of anthropogenic emission by sources and removals by sinks of greenhouse gases, the outlines of the biannual transparency report and national inventory document, the outline for technical expert review report, including of the national inventory, and the training program for technical experts participating in the technical expert review. Also, the UNFCCC Secretariat was requested to develop reporting tools, electronic reporting tools for the electronic reporting of the common reporting tables and common tabular formats. As well, the Glasgow decision encouraged development country parties to prepare and submit project proposals to receive support from the Global Environment Facility for support for transparency reports, including also the, of course, including the greenhouse gas emission and removal informations. Next slide, please. About the current UNFCCC decisions on the Annex 1 parties inventory reporting and review. As it was shown on one of the previous slides, the Paris Agreement Enhanced Transparency Framework is built on the currently used transparency arrangements under the Convention, mainly on decisions adopted for the Annex 1 parties reporting. So it is useful to have in mind these decisions and guidelines which are currently in use. The key reporting and review guidelines in the pre-Paris Agreement period are the following. Guidelines for the preparation of national communications by parties included in Annex 1 to the Convention. Part 1, UNFCCC reporting guidelines on annual greenhouse gas inventories. These guidelines were adopted by the Conference of the Parties, decision 24/CP.19 in 2015. The next is guidelines for the technical review of information reported under the Convention related to the greenhouse gas inventories, biannual reports, and national communications by parties included in Annex 1 to the Convention, were adopted by the UNFCCC Conference of the Parties, decision 13/CP.20 in 2014. Now it is expected that the UNFCCC reporting guidelines for national greenhouse gas inventories will be harmonized with the adopted Paris Agreement reporting guidelines. So next, please. About the methodological guidelines for the national inventories preparation. First of all, guidelines adopted for mandatory use both under UNFCCC and Paris Agreement. It is Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 2006 IPCC guidelines for national greenhouse gas inventories. These guidelines are mandatory. Guidelines adopted for voluntary use under the UNFCCC and Paris Agreement. It is the IPCC 2013 supplement to the 2006 IPCC guidelines supplement on wetlands. And at last, the guidelines adopted for voluntary use under the Paris Agreement. It is the IPCC 2019 refinement to the 2006 IPCC guidelines for national greenhouse gas inventories. They were adopted for the first time and were not in use before. Next slide, please. Each party should implement and maintain national inventory arrangements, including institutional, legal, and procedural arrangements for the continued estimation, compilation, and timely reporting of national inventory reports in accordance with MPGs. National inventory arrangements can vary by party depending on their national circumstances and preferences, and can change over time. Each party should, to the extent possible, identify, update regularly, and include in the biennial transparency report information on improvements to its reporting, including with respect to GHG emissions and removals. Next slide, please. The guiding principles of methodologies. To estimate anthropogenic emissions by sources and removal by sinks of greenhouse gases not controlled by the Montreal Protocol, the parties shall use methodologies provided by the IPCC guidelines and adopted by the UNFCCC Conference of the Parties and/or Paris Agreement meeting of the parties. Any supplementary methodologies agreed by the Conference of Parties. National methodologies, which parties consider better able to reflect their national situation, provided that these methodologies are compatible with the 2006 IPCC guidelines and are well documented and scientifically based. Estimates of emissions and removals in the inventory reports are grouped by sector. Sectors combine homogeneous activities or processes, homogeneous sources and sinks. First sector is energy, including emissions from fuel combustion and fugitive emissions from fuels. The next sector is industrial processes and fuel use. The next, agriculture, land use change and forestry, and waste. Sectors are subdivided to subsectors or specific categories, and reporting is disaggregated by sectors, by sources, sinks, and gases. Next, please. What is key categories? In the development of inventory, an analysis should be carried out to identify key categories. A key category is a category that has a significant influence on the total aggregate emissions on greenhouse gases, or on the trend of total emissions over time, or on the uncertainty of total emissions. Identified key categories should be given priority in the allocation of resources on data collection and analyzing, on quality assurance and quality control, on the development of the reports. The analysis for identifying key categories is carried out in two ways, taking into account and not taking into account the land use change, and forestry sector. The inventory shall include the results of the identification of key categories for the base year and for the last reporting year. The next slide, please. Good practice is a set of inventory methodological principles, actions, and procedures. Inventories that are consistent with good practice are those inventories that appear to contain neither overestimation nor underestimation, and where uncertainties are reduced as much as practicable. The 2006 IPCC guidelines provide good practice guidance for specific emissions and sinks categories and for general inventory procedures. For each source or sink category, the 2006 guidelines provide at least two methodologies for estimating emissions or removals of greenhouse gases. Tier 1 methodologies are the simplest, requiring less resources on collection, on data collection, and on producing emission or sink estimates. Tier 2 and Tier 3 methodologies may involve the collection of information from individual facilities. Mass balanced approach may need using national developed emission factors and generally needs more resources. Next slide, please. To estimate greenhouse gases emissions or removals in the specific category of sources of sinks, the numeric information on activity data and emission factor are necessary. For each category, the 2006 guidelines contain the Tier 1 or default methodologies. These methodologies include default emission factors and, in some cases, default activity data. For the case sources, Tier 2 or Tier 3 methodologies should be used. Parties should use their own national emission factors or methodologies, and if available, provided that they are developed in accordance with the IPCC guidelines and considered to be more accurate than the default ones. Where country-specific emission factors or methodologies are, or other parameters, where country-specific information is not available, emission factors or other parameters provided in the IPCC emission factor database may be used if a party can demonstrate that these parameters are applicable for its specific national circumstances and are more accurate than the default values in the IPCC guidelines. Next slide, please. To ensure the correct approach to selecting methodologies, the IPCC guidelines provide decision trees. Here is an example shown, the decision tree for the ammonia production category in the industrial processes and product use sector. For this source, the IPCC guidelines provide three methodological levels. The choice of level depends on the national circumstances of the country and depends on whether ammonia production is a key category. Next slide, please. Uncertainties. Emissions or removals uncertainty estimates should be quantified for all sources and sink categories. An analysis of the uncertainty of the total GHG emissions and the uncertainty of the total emissions trend is also performed. The IPCC guidelines provide two approaches to assessing uncertainties. Approach one is based on using a relatively simple method, so-called error propagation method. And approach two involves the use of the Monte Carlo statistic method or similar methods. As a minimum, approach one should be implemented in the inventory. Use of approach two or combination of approaches one and two is also recommended. Uncertainty estimates should be made for the base year, for the last year of the inventory, and for the trend of total emission between these 2 years. Please, next slide. About the general methodological issues and approaches. In each category, estimates of emissions and removals for the entire time series included in the inventory, base year and all subsequent years should be made using the same methodologies. Activity data and emission factors should be obtained in a consistent manner. This approach provides undistorted estimate of emission and removal trends. In some cases, it may not be possible to use the same methods and consistent databases for all years of the inventory. In such cases, emissions or removals are calculated using alternative methods, which are provided in the 2006 IPCC guidelines. Information on the alternative methods used should be documented and included in the inventory. Recalculations of emissions and removals are performed to improve the accuracy and/or completeness of the inventory. Reasons for recalculations are discussed in more detail in the IPCC guidelines. When performing recalculations, the consistency of time series should be ensured. In the event of a change in the methodology or method of collection the respected activity data or change of emission factors, parties shall recalculate the inventories for the whole time series. Next slide, please. Quality assessment and quality control. Each party shall develop an inventory QA/QC plan and implement the overall quality control procedures in accordance with this plan, following the IPCC guidelines. Category-specific quality control procedures should also be applied for key categories and for those categories which have undergone significant methodological changes and/or data revision. In addition, it is necessary to carry out an independent peer reviews of inventories in accordance with the 2006 guidelines. This reviews also applies to quality assurance procedures. In other words, these reviews are necessary to quality assurance procedures. A significant role for improving the quality of the inventory is played by the implementing recommendations of the technical expert reviews and facilitative multilateral consideration of progress. This is two separate processes as a part of implementation. I will not describe it in my presentation because of lack of time. The next slide, please. Flexibility for developing countries. The application of flexibility for those developing country parties that's needed in the light of their capabilities is left to the discretion of the reporting party. The party shall clearly indicate the provision to which flexibility applies, briefly explain its limitations, and indicate its self-determined approximate time frame for improvements associated with such limitations of its capabilities. The flexibilities are the right to identify key categories using a threshold of at least 85% instead of 95% threshold specified in the 2006 IPCC guidelines. The right to provide a qualitative uncertainty analysis instead of quantitative one for key categories in cases where there are no quantitative data for uncertainty analysis. The right to apply higher thresholds to cut off minor, not assessed in the inventories categories. The right to develop a quality assurance and control plan and to provide information on the general quality control procedures on a voluntary basis. Next slide, please. The mandatory provisions for developing countries using flexibilities are the following. Providing information on at least 3 greenhouse gases, CO2, methane, and nitrous oxides, and reporting on HFCs, PFCs, SF6 and NF3 if they are included in the national determined contributions under Article 4 of the Paris Agreement, or if these gases are covered by an activity under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, or if these gases have also already been reported in the information earlier. Each party shall provide annual data series in 1990, but those developing countries that need flexibility should at minimum provide data covering the base year or base period for their nationally determined contributions. And in addition, all annual data series going back to at least 2020. Next slide, please. Thank you. And you can see more information on the site which is shown on this slide. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Veronica, would you like to continue, please?
Yes, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you very much. Could you please share my presentation? I think it would be better. Yeah, thank you very much. I will continue the presentation of the tool prepared by the Institute of Global Climate and Ecology together with UNESCAP and introduce probably some short specific details about the sector methodologies. Of course, I'm not going to present all methodological details today because usually takes several days for presentation of the whole details of the sectoral methodologies. But I would like more to introduce how to use our tool and for which it could be helpful. Next one, please. So when entering the website of the tool, you can see the specific bottom for the guidance per sector. And next one, please. Yes, and when entering this sector guidelines, the users can find the specific methodological information for each sector: energy, industrial process and product use, agriculture sector, land use change and forestry, so-called LULUCF sector, and waste sector. Next one, please. So what were the main goals of this tool? Of course, it's not to repeat all what is provided in the IPCC methodology, but we try to provide quite simple and clear explanation of main principles for each sector and categories of the inventory, and try to share the 20 years experience of the EGC inventory team in preparation and reviewing of greenhouse gases inventory in all sectors. Underline possible challenges which organizations responsible for the estimations and preparations of national greenhouse inventories would meet on specific sector topics, under the preparation of inventory, particularly under the activity data collection, because that is probably one of the most challenged step in the preparation of the inventory, especially for the countries who probably not prepared such inventory in detail and previously, because detailed inventory, greenhouse gas inventory for the whole country and for all sectors needs a lot of very different and very detailed activity data, and it's a real challenge to collect all of them. They also provide some specific information about how to choose the estimation parameters and develop a country-specific emission factors where it is appropriate and where it is possible for the country, for particularly for key categories, and also provide some information about the inventory reporting, because that is also a separate step for the organization, not only to underline all necessary calculations and estimations, but also to prepare the inventory report and to fill the reporting tables in the proper way. Next one, please. So, of course, all methodology provided in the tool is based on the IPCC 2006 guidelines for national greenhouse gas inventory, but we also use some additional materials and methodologies adopted by the UNFCCC Conference of the Parties. And guidelines contain all reference, clarification, and useful tips to support the estimations and inventory efforts. All links in the interactive version lead directly to the required section pages, original data sources, or useful supplementary resources which can be used and which should be used for the inventory preparation. The appropriate approaches to and examples using national methodologies with best reflected the national circumstances are provided, on conditions that such methodologies are consistent with the IPCC guidelines, scientifically based and properly documented. Next one. On the next slide, I will just show how it is organized in the website version of the tool. You can see that all detailed explanation on the particular sector are provided with the links to appropriate methodological background source, and if you click on this, next one please. Yes, you will see that the appropriate chapter or page of the 2006 inventory, IPCC inventory guidelines is opened, and you can see all recommendations which are given there and all methodological details. Next one, please. So how the tool presents the structure of each sector and each category. So first of all, it is provide a short description of the category, particularly which sources should be considered in this particular category or in this particular sector. Basic methodological approaches to emission or removals estimation, availability and short description on methodological tiers, as it was presented by Alexander in previous presentations. The main ideas of the different tiers which can be used based on some factors and activity data collected for the whole country, or particularly specifically for country-specific emissions parameters used at the tiers 2, or some detail by source parameters which are usually used for tier 3. That is a general principle, but of course for each category and for each sectors, there are a bit different background information which can be used for different tiers, and we provide a short explanation which is considered in this particular category or in this particular sector. Also, they present the basic approaches for activity data collection, for the choice of emission estimation parameters. They also put great attention to cross-cutting issues because it is also one of the most challenged points in the preparation of the inventory. And I will put a bit more attention to this further in the presentation. Also describe the quality control procedures and how uncertainty estimations. In each category, we provide information on how to fill the reporting tables and how to report the data, particularly for this sector and for this category, and also provide some expert recommendations based on our experience. What are the main problems related to the calculations, and what are common mistakes for each particular sector and category. And also we provide information about the availability of refinements for specific source category in 2019 refinement to the 2006 IPCC guidelines. And of course, it is not accepted yet by the Conference of the Parties for as a mandatory methodological base for preparation of greenhouse gas inventory. But the methodologies provided in 2019 refinements could be used by the countries under the particular conditions if it is more close to country-specific circumstances, and we provide some explanation in which case and under which conditions this new methodologies could be used in each particular sector and category. Next one, please. So coming to the sectors, of course, I will not go to the details, but would like to present some general ideas of what is included under each of the sectors and what probably are the main points which are underlined in the tool which we are presenting now. So energy sector, of course, it's for most countries the most important sector with the biggest share of emissions, particularly CO2 emissions from this category. It could be up to 85–19% for some countries of the total national emissions produced in the energy sector. Under the IPCC structure of the sectors reporting, energy sector covers two main big types of emission sources. The first one is combustion of fossil fuels. All sources are connected with the combustion of the fossil fuels, including stationary combustion and mobile combustion. And the other big part of energy sector is fugitive emission, that is emission from exploration and exploitation of primary energy sources, and conversion of primary energy sources into more usable energy forms in refineries and power plants. Also include leakages and fugitive emissions during transmission and distributions of fossil fuels. This picture used by the UNFCCC in the training materials on the UNFCCC, I think, is very good present all interconnections between the different types of emission sources in energy sector, and indicate the main greenhouse gases which should be considered in the energy sector. This is first of all carbon dioxide, of course, which is the main gases for all sources of fossil fuel combustion, and methane, which is mainly released during the fugitive emissions from fossil fuels exploration, primary production, and transmission and distribution. Next one, please. For inventory purposes, that is also important point that under the fuel combustion, we consider all types of combustion of the fossil fuels which leads to production of heat and the mechanic work process, or for use away from that process where it was produced. And that is an important point for disaggregation of the data between energy sector and industrial sector, which we also discuss. I will present a bit late in the next slides. Under the part of fuel combustion, it is used to estimate emission by two main approaches. So that is sectoral approaches, which is the main method for estimating emissions from the combustion of fuel and energy resources in the calculation of emissions by sectors of economy. The result of the sectoral approach is used in the estimation of total national emissions, and reference approaches, the result of the calculation under the reference approaches is not used in the calculation of national total, but it is used to independently verify the completeness and correctness of the calculations in the sectoral approach. And it is very important to use this reference approach to be sure that all sources in energy sectors is included, and that the difference between reference and sectoral approach is under the allowed level. Methodological approach to estimating emissions for the sectoral approach is differ for stationary fuel source and mobile sources. It's obviously because for stationary sources, we should report emissions from energy industries itself, from combustion on fossil fuels with energy purposes at enterprises of manufacturing industries and under the construction, and in other sources, including commercial and institutional use and combustion of fossil fuels, residential use, and use of fossil fuels in forestry, agriculture, and fisheries, and also under the other types of stationary fuels. And under the mobile sources, we consider civil aviation, road transport, railway transport, navigation, and other transportation, including pipelines. It's also important to underline that there are so-called memo items, such as, for example, bunker fuel used for international aviation and international navigation, which also should be calculated but not included in the national totals and reported separately as a memo items. Next one, please. So on the slide, I just listed fuel types which are considered under the energy sector. And I would like just to underline the important understanding that the type of secondary fuels is determined not by the state of aggregation, but by the type of fuel from which it is produced. And that is important because in the reporting tables usually provide information not by each particular type of fuel, but aggregated by solid fuels and liquid fuels and gas fuels and other types of fuels and peat. And that is very important to be sure in the proper aggregation of secondary fuels under the particular type of fuels. Next one, please. Fugitive emission, I told already that source of greenhouse gas emissions is this sub-sector are oil and gas facilities and the coal mining industries. They emit directly greenhouse gas emissions of carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrogen oxide. But of course, the main gas for this subcategory is methane, except only the flaring of gas, which carbon dioxide is the main type of greenhouse, but it's usually not the biggest part of this fugitive emission subsector. Methodologies for estimating fugitive emission from the energy sector are very different from those used for fossil fuel combustion. And of course, it needs a separate presentation and separate explanation of all approaches listed under the fugitive emission methodology. And fugitive emission includes subcategories of solid fuel, coal mining and handling, underground mining, surface mining, and other. And another big part is oil and gas mining, primary production, and transmission, and venting and flaring. Next one, please. So the sector of industrial process and product use is another very big and very complicated sector, because it includes a very different types of industries. And of course, under each of these industries, there are different specific basic methodology which is used and which is applicable particularly to each of these type of industries. Industrial process sector consider emissions of greenhouse gases occurring from industrial process, from the use of greenhouse gases in products, and from non-energy use of fossil fuels. You can see that it is disaggregated by mineral industry, chemical industry, metal industry, non-energy products from fuel and solvent use, product use and substitutes of ozone depleting substances, other project manufacture use, and electronic industry, and other types of industry not included in the previous subcategories. And also it is important to underline that in the industrial process and product use sector, where we estimate not only three main greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrogen, but also so-called F gases, which are specifically emitted from the industrial process. Next one, please. The next slide just shortly explain this issue, which I have already underlined previously, that allocation of emissions from the use of fossil fuels between the energy and IPPO sector is a really very complex task, and it's usually quite difficult to collect the proper activity data to separate those processes which should be considered under the IPPO sector from those processes which should be reported under the energy sector. But it's very important to understand this process and to do the most detailed and the most accurate disaggregation of this data as it is possible for the country. And another principle which is also very important and probably the most important in this aspect is to ensure that there is no underestimation or double estimation of fossil fuel flows in between the industrial sector and the energy sector. That is, I'm just presenting this probably in details, just to give you understanding of what subjects, what topics are discussed in details in the tools, which we have prepared, and to underline where we try to share the experience and which type of problems we try to underline under our tool. Next one, please. Yeah, so coming further, we move to agriculture sector, which of course also quite complicated one, and it deals with greenhouse gas emissions from animal husbandry and crop production. The main greenhouse gas emissions are methane, nitrogen oxide, and CO2 in this order of importance for this sector. Greenhouse gas emissions is carried out under 6 land use categories. That is emissions from enteric fermentation, emissions from manure management system, direct and indirect nitrogen oxide emissions from managed soils, emissions from rice cultivation, greenhouse gas emissions from on-site burning of agriculture crop residues, and emissions from lime and urea application in managed soils. Next one, please. Next one. Okay, thank you. So probably I will not discuss in the detail, but you can look in this slides later what are the main sources, the most important sources of the emissions from enteric fermentation, that is the methane, and emissions from manure management system, which include direct N2 emissions, ocular combined nitrification and denitrification of nitrogen contained in the manure, and also indirect emissions result from volatile nitrogen losses that occur primarily on the forms of the ammonia and NOx. Next one, please. Yes, and also represent the main sources and main gases important for N2O emission from managed soils. Next one will not discuss it in detail. Next one, please. Okay. So land use change and forestry sector. That is a very specific sector which cover carbon stock change, associated CO2 emissions and removals, as well as other greenhouse gases emissions due to the use and change in use of land. Greenhouse gases emissions and CO2 removals are carried out under 6 land use categories: forest land, cropland, grassland, wetland, settlements, and other land. And of course, LULUCF sector differs from other sectors in that it covers sea stock and sea pools. Forest land includes all land with woody vegetation consistent with threshold use to define forest land in the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory. This land use category is subdivided into forest land, remaining forest land, and land covered to forest land. Estimation of greenhouse gas fluxes is made for the following pools: biomass, dead organic matter, and soil organic matter. Next one, please. And harvest wood production. This category includes all wood-based materials that have been removed from the harvest site. It is divided in 2 groups: solid wood products and paper products, and are not really carbon sink, but carbon storage. The wood product value share contributes to the removal of CO2 from atmosphere, because CO2 removals are key. It stores as carbon in products is used in well-managed landfills. There are 3 approaches to estimate carbon stock change in harvest wood products pool. It's stock change, production, and atmospheric flow. Next one, please. And the last sector, but which is coming to be a very important sector for the greenhouse gases emissions, particularly for methane emissions, because probably that is the only sector which is going to lead, emissions from which is going to lead and continue to lead. And greenhouse sector report greenhouse gases, mainly methane and N2O, as I said, CO2 only in the case of waste combustion. Greenhouse gases emission source is disaggregated for solid waste disposal, biological treatment of solid waste, and incineration and open burning on waste, and wastewater treatment and discharge. CO2 emission from landfills and combustion of bio-waste and biogas are not included in the national totals of greenhouse emissions, and because it is considered under the sector of agriculture. And biogas emitted from waste and field management can be brought. Greenhouse gas emissions are insignificant, but can be included in the waste sector. Greenhouse gas emissions from use of waste as a fuel and feedstock should be reported under energy and IPPO sector. And that is, again, some examples of cross-cutting issues, which are very important and which are discussed in the details. Emissions from manure management are assigned to the agriculture sector, and greenhouse gas emissions, the source of which are not the waste itself, but the activity for handling them, should also be attributed to the relevant sectors. That is another example. So I would like to underline that waste sector is also use specific methodology for each of the subcategory which is included in the sector, and which are also discussed in the details, and activity data collection for this sector is also usually a big challenge for the preparation of the inventory. So next one, I think that at the end of the presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. And at the end, I would just like to invite you to visit the website where our tool is presented, and of course we would be ready and glad to answer all the questions if you have it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ginsberg and Dr. Lipka and Nakhutin. That was a very comprehensive presentation, providing so much important and useful information for the inventory experts. Of course, the time was not enough to cover all the details, and we will have to leave it to the future in-person workshops. Now we're going to look at the questions submitted by the participants and get them answered. And I would like to go back to the presentation on the COP26 given by Sergey and Vitor. We have a question from Aneta. Can you elaborate on the Glasgow work program on action for climate engagement? And another question is from Sophie, and it's about interoperability between reporting tools and the IPCC inventory software. I think Vitor can give some clarification on this. Sergey, would you like to go first?
Yeah, that's fine. And indeed, Vitor would respond to the IPCC related questions. Regarding the ACE work program, the Glasgow conference adopted 2 decisions on that work program, which are the same text, but under different bodies. Well, there are quite a few pages, so I will not go through them, of course, but maybe one should just indicate 2 things. First, the decision contains as an annex this work program, which contains the principles, the scope of work, the priority areas for its related work activities, and then importantly, it provides guidance on the implementation of the 6 elements of action for climate empowerment. These are education, training, public awareness, public access to information, public participation, and international cooperation. So that's what the work program itself contains. But the second part, which was an important achievement of Glasgow, was a number of activities decided to help in the implementation of this program. From this year, from the June sessions, we will have an annual ACE dialogue. It will happen now annually during the media session, and then there will be a report on this dialogue to be considered at the second session. There was a decision to develop a specific action plan on ACE during this year, so we hope to see at the end of this year a specific action plan consistent with this work program, and the decision also indicated some timeline for a mid-term review of the implementation and the final review of this 10-year program. And for more details, please visit our website and look through the decision. It is very comprehensive. Thanks, and then over to Vitor for the IPCC question.
Thank you, Sergey. I don't know, maybe I can read the question. The question was about interoperability between the reporting tools, UNFCCC reporting tools and the IPCC. And and it's about if it would require streamlining. For added clarity, the IPCC software is the inventory tool, and which goal is to prepare inventory submissions by parties. And it's used by a number of parties, in particular by developing countries. And it was been prepared just in the follow-up on the publications of 2006 IPCC guidelines. For the UNFCCC, it's not an inventory compiler, it's a reporting tool. So parties prepare their inventories, and then they use this to report emissions, or we call it submit emissions to UNFCCC. So there's a little difference there. And in addition, there are differences in terms of the reporting categories, or between the IPCC and the UNFCCC. For instance, we have under the IPCC, we have AFOLU sector, which is agriculture, forestries, and other land use change. And under the UNFCCC, the parties agreed on the different classifications, though. So there's a difference between the sector agriculture and the sector LULUCF, which is land use change, and forestry. So, and also there's slight difference in the names of categories, which sometimes are different. And of course, UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement have the flexibility options, which is something particular to the UNFCCC. So we're starting the work between the IPCC and the UNFCCC, or it's going to start very soon. And the idea is that this will be developed in parallel with the reporting tools. And that I said was about 2024, and also there were some other activities like workshops. So it's not necessarily streamlining, but ensuring that the communication channels between the two tools are available, and ensuring that the output of one tool can communicate well with the other. I hope that clarifies. Thank you very much, Yutyung and Sergey. Back to you.
Thank you so much for your responses. Now, I will turn to the IGCE team. We have a number of questions for you. And the first one is for Dr. Lipka. Is the emission factor database better than using the manufacturer's emission factors? Could you give a brief answer to this question?
Well, I can try to answer. The national activity data and nationally developed emission factors are preferable for use for estimating emissions and removals. Of course, if such data and emission factors are reliable, are robust, if you have both the national data and the IPCC emission factors database data, you should prefer the national data. And if you need to use the IPCC EFDB data, of course, you shall estimate if these emission factors or other parameters are applicable to the circumstances of your country. But national data and emission factors are preferable. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nakutin. We have two more questions for you, actually. The next one is about environmental integrity. So in your presentation, you mentioned ensuring environmental integrity as one of the modalities, procedures, and guiding principles for the enhanced transparency framework. The question is there a definition for this?
Yes, it is a complex concept. I will just read two definitions. First is ecosystems with environmental integrity need to be self-sustaining and self-regulating without requiring human interference. The second definition is environmental integrity is a condition where the natural processes of a place occur with the strength and frequency expected in the region. So it also means that human interference is not seen. In the more philosophic meaning, maintaining the environmental integrity is as less interference in the natural processes as possible. This is for the second question.
Thank you. And the last one for you. Could you share your experience on how Russia ensured consistency and accuracy of activity data for historical years, in particular from 1990 to 2000, when the data sets are not presented as robustly as post-2000?
Yes, I would like to say that Russia is not in a bad position in relation to the historical data, because we began the reporting to UNFCCC of greenhouse gases emissions and removals from 1994. Our first reporting was included into the first national communication of the Russian Federation. And collection of activity data was begun even earlier. But of course, we have some problems with it. And we use standard IPCC recommended approaches as it is described in the first volume of the 2006 IPCC guidelines. It includes interpolation or extrapolation of activity data. It includes using drivers or proxy data for indirect estimation of the activities. For example, an economic activities data or a number of population which is involved in the processes leading to the emissions of greenhouse gases. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now, for Dr. Ginsberg, I have a couple of questions for you too. The first one is, in Palestine, we don't have estimation for IPPU emissions since we don't have heavy industries, but only light industries. Does this influence the accuracy of GHG inventory? Can you please give an answer to this one?
Yes, thank you for the question. Of course, if any country do not have any type of industrial process or any other type of the sources listed among the categories and sectors of the IPCC reporting structure. Of course, in this case, the country should not report this, should not estimate this emission because it does not occur in the country. But anyway, in the reporting tables, the country should indicate that this type of source is not existing in the country, and that emissions from this type of the source is not occurring in the country. So there are special rules for how to indicate in this case the information in the reporting tables, and in this case, of course, the absence of the data about the emissions from the sources will not influence the accuracy of the greenhouse gas inventories. But all rules of the reporting rules should be followed.
Thank you very much. Another question is about the fact that default activity data are sometimes used together with default emission factors. Can you please elaborate on that further and provide an example?
Yeah, thank you. If the country uses default activity, I don't know what is default activity data, but there is default emission factors and default calculation parameters, then it is relevant for use of so-called tier 1 methodology. In this case, the country should use the aggregated activity data for the whole country without detailization of its specific, for example, for region or for particular type of particular source. And then for this tier 1 methodology, default emission factors, so default calculation parameters which are provided in the IPCC guidelines could be applied. But in case if a particular source is estimated as a key source, it was explained in the presentation made by Alexander Nakhutin that key source are the sources which contribute up to 95% of total national emissions of the country. In this case, it is preferable to use country-specific calculation parameters, country-specific emission factors, if, of course, it is available and if it can be elaborated by the country.
Thank you so much. For Dr. Ginsberg, I know Sophie has asked a few clarification questions, but because of the limited time we have, I would like to ask Dr. Ginsberg to please answer these questions in the chat for Sophie after probably your closing remarks. And for the environmental integrity question, I would like to give the floor to Sergey from UNFCCC to maybe add some more points on the previous response.
Oh, it's not more points. Thank you. It's just to caution a bit about definitions, because it's such a broad concept, and normally what one has to do when you deal with this, one has to drill down or to operationalize this definition depending on what you are talking about. So for greenhouse gas inventory, it would be something of what Dr. Nakhutin covered. But if you look, for example, into UNFCCC decisions on Article 6 on the market-based mechanism or bilateral cooperation, environmental integrity in that context would be different, and some attempts to define what it is was made also in those Glasgow decisions on Article 6 mechanism. So just be careful. It's a difficult concept. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you all speakers and participants for this great questions and answers. Now we are approaching the closing of the workshop. I would like to ask you to warmly welcome Dr. Veronica Ginsberg again for her closing remarks.
Thank you very much. I would like just to thank you, the organizer of the conference, with this, I think, this excellent event, which was yesterday, was also following the discussion yesterday and today. And I think that is really a very high quality presentation and very relevant information which was presented during these 2 days. I hope that this would be helpful for all participants of the seminar. And thank you very much for organizing and for inviting the Institute of Global Climate and Ecology to participate in this event. And thank you for the possibility to present this tool which we have prepared together with UNESCAP. And I really hope for the continuation of this very useful cooperation, and we are always open for any discussion and any help if you need, and any further cooperation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Now, please welcome our last speaker, Mr. Chun-Kyu Park, head of UNOSD, for his closing remarks.
Thank you, Yoo Jung Kim, and thank you, Dr. Veronica Ginsberg, for your last remarks. Distinguished participants, partners, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure to make this final remarks for the post-greenhouse gas inventory system training workshop. I would like to firstly thank again every participant from all around in the Asia-Pacific region. My special thanks go to our co-organizing partners, UNESCAP, Aneta was there, but I'm not sure, but thank you, Aneta, and Ms. Katinka Weinberger, and also other UNESCO, IGCE, and the TGO, and my UN OSS staff, who did not spare any effort to organize this meaningful and important workshop. I would also like to extend my sincere gratitude to the speakers. I think that each of the presentation and the discussions at this year's workshop provided much valuable insight and practical and detailed examples and methodologies on how the national greenhouse gas inventories, particularly for the Asia-Pacific countries, can be effectively made and utilized to contribute to the implementation of SDG 13 and the Paris Agreement, including the Glasgow Pact. This year's workshop allowed us to continue to highlight the importance of carbon neutrality and climate ambition, exchange of knowledge and national government experience for advancing climate action, expanding of our understanding the transparent and reliable greenhouse gas emissions inventories and Paris Agreement reporting methodologies. Finally, and advancement of our cooperation in promoting climate action and implementation of the SDGs. The invaluable knowledge and the shared experience of organizations, national governments, and regions at this workshop helped us further illustrate and learn from the progress being made towards advancing GHG inventories and the undeniable importance in combating climate change and achieving the 2030 agenda. Dear distinguished participants, as we have all collectively witnessed, despite the pandemic-related economic slowdown, the devastating impact of climate change on our communities and its rising pace have become increasingly evident. In continuing our pandemic recovery efforts, we must continue to urgently take critical steps toward carbon neutrality by fully understanding the strong interlink this climate change to the SDGs. My organization, the UNOS, is committed to promoting the implementation of the 2030 Agenda through strengthening cooperation with members of international organizations, national governments, and institutions and civil societies. We are determined to effectively continue supporting the acceleration of climate action in the most conducive way by fostering knowledge sharing, capacity development, research, training, and partnership building. The challenge is enormous, but so are our capabilities when we act together. In this regard, my organization, UNOS, is pleased to announce that we offer policy advisory support and training courses for national governments on GHG inventory system and reporting. Please let us know through the post-event survey if you are interested in receiving policy support and capacity building tailored to your country's needs and circumstances. Once again, I thank each and every one of you for joining the fourth GHG inventory training workshop and for your meaningful and very valuable contributions. I hope to see you again in the following year's workshop that will be held in Bangkok, might be in Bangkok, Thailand, in pace. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Park. On behalf of all the organizers, I am truly grateful for your participation in this fourth greenhouse gas inventory training workshop. I hope this was a learning opportunity for you. Before you leave, I kindly ask everyone to please participate in the survey in the link provided in the chat box. Your feedback on this event will be of great help in planning our future events. Thank you all again, and please stay safe from the COVID, and I wish to see you all again next year. Thank you so much.